For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union looked like the only real rival to America. It controlled half of Europe. It had nuclear weapons, vast armies, and a command over land, resources, and people that no empire in history had ever matched. Its ideology claimed to be the future. Its rockets put the first satellite and the first human into space. On paper, this was the system that was supposed to outgrow capitalism, to make boom and bust cycles obsolete, to plan prosperity from above, and then, in less than a single generation, it was gone. No foreign army occupied Moscow, no world war ended with the Red Army surrendering. Instead, the Soviet Union simply stopped existing, broken apart by forces that most of its citizens never voted on and that many outsiders didn't fully understand until it was over. How does a system strong enough to defeat Nazi Germany build a nuclear arsenal and hold an empire from Berlin to Vladivostok collapse without losing a conventional war? This is the story of how the Soviet Union paid for control with stagnation, for prestige with hidden debt and decay, and for silence with pressure that eventually had nowhere left to go, and why the pattern it followed is less foreign to today's world than we'd like to admit. Peak and Golden Age. To understand the collapse, we have to start in the moment when the system seems to work. In the 1950s and 60s, after the devastation of World War II, the Soviet Union rebuilds at remarkable speed. Heavy industry, steel production, and military output surge. Cities destroyed by war are reconstructed. The Red Army occupies Eastern Europe, and communist governments are installed from East Berlin to Bucharest. Abroad, the Soviet Union looks formidable. At home, life for many citizens is still harsh, but it is undeniably better than it was under war and famine. The command economy has a simple promise. If you sacrifice now, if you accept centralized control, the state will guarantee full employment, basic housing, and rapid industrial growth. For a while, the numbers seem to support the story. Gigantic hydroelectric dams, steel plants, and factories rise out of former farmland. Space achievements shock the world. Sputnik in 1957, Gagarin in 1961. To many observers, it seems possible, maybe even likely, that the Soviet Union will eventually overtake the West. If you model the world as a race in heavy industry and military hardware, the USSR looks like it's catching up fast. But even in this golden phase, some cracks are already visible. The system is good at making more of what it already decided to make: tanks, rockets, steel, and much worse at admitting that it might be making the wrong things. The early success hides an uncomfortable truth, that the Soviet model is trading flexibility and feedback for speed and control. That trade will become more and more expensive over time. Mistakes, escalation, and internal pressure. The first structural problem is simple: information. In a planned economy, the center has to decide how much of everything to produce. Not just tanks and tractors, but shoes, bread, apartments, telephone lines, and light bulbs. But the information needed to do this well is scattered among millions of people living real lives. Prices in a market system are messy and unfair, but they also carry signals: what's scarce, what's in demand, what's worth investing in. In the Soviet system, those signals are replaced by plans, quotas, and reports. On paper, factories meet their targets. On paper, farms deliver their quotas. On paper, there is balance. In reality, something else is happening. Managers game the numbers to avoid punishment. They hoard inputs. They meet tonnage targets by producing heavier, cruder goods. Nails by weight instead of useful nails. Workers show up, but their incentive is to follow the rules minimally, not to innovate or experiment. Over time, the statistics continue to look impressive, but the real quality of goods and the real responsiveness of the system lags further and further behind. The second problem is the cost of empire. After World War II, the Soviet Union does not just control its own territory, it effectively owns an entire security zone in Eastern Europe, funds friendly regimes around the world, and keeps a massive military machine on permanent alert. Maintaining that posture is expensive. Resources that could have gone into consumer goods, infrastructure, or modernization at home are instead poured into tanks, missiles, and subsidies for allies. The third problem is the ideological blockade against acknowledging failure. In a system that claims to be scientific and historically inevitable, admitting that something is fundamentally wrong isn't just a policy dispute, it's heresy. So the response to stagnation is often more of the same. More plans, more campaigns, more slogans. When agriculture underperforms, the leadership launches grand schemes to catch up and overtake, rather than quietly asking why incentives are broken. When consumer goods are poor, the solution is to blame shortcomings, not to question whether the planning mechanism itself might be flawed. The result is a growing gap between everyday reality and official language. People see empty shelves, long queues, and poor quality products. But the television talks about record harvests, heroic workers, and inevitable progress. That gap is not just psychological, it translates into misallocated resources, projects that look good on paper, but waste real materials, and a culture of pretending that all targets are being met. The fourth problem is competition, not just from rival countries, but from the visible, lived comparison with the West. Through radio signals, smuggled media, and travel, Soviet citizens become increasingly aware of how people live in Western Europe and North America. They see not just propaganda, but jeans, refrigerators, cars, and grocery stores that don't run out of basic items. The Soviet Union can match the West in missiles and tanks. It struggles to match it in everyday life. By the 1970s, the growth that once seemed unstoppable is slowing. Oil exports temporarily mask some of the deeper issues, providing hard currency to buy grain and technology from abroad. But that windfall is used to patch the system, not to fundamentally reform it. The pattern is becoming clear. A system built for forced industrial catch-up is being asked to deliver sustained, innovative prosperity without the feedback mechanisms that would tell it how. Crisis and collapse. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union faces a convergence of pressures. Economic growth has decelerated, infrastructure is aging, the arms race with the United States is absorbing enormous resources. The Afghan war has become a costly, demoralizing quagmire. At the same time, a new generation of leaders recognizes that more of the same is not working. Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power with a diagnosis. The system needs restructuring, Perestroika, and openness, Glasnost. The idea is not to abolish socialism, but to save it by making it more honest and efficient. But honesty has a cost. Glasnost means that problems which were once contained in private conversations now spill into public debate. People begin talking openly about corruption, environmental disasters, ethnic tensions, and the hidden traumas of past purges and famines. Perestroika, meanwhile, tries to introduce limited market mechanisms and decentralization into a system that was never designed for them. Instead of a clean transition, the result is a kind of hybrid. Too much looseness for central control to function as before, too little clarity and trust for markets to coordinate effectively. Enterprises get more freedom, but the price system is still distorted. Local leaders gain more autonomy, but the institutional framework is weak. Inflationary pressures build, shortages worsen. People with access to goods and connections learn how to profit from the chaos. At the imperial level, the effects are even more dramatic. Republics within the USSR and satellite states in Eastern Europe see an opportunity. If the center is admitting failure, if it is no longer willing to use unlimited force to maintain control, then the cost of demanding independence suddenly looks much lower. In 1989, a chain reaction begins in Eastern Europe. Regimes fall, borders open, the Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union formally still exists. But the inner logic of the empire has been broken. Inside the Union, republics begin asserting their sovereignty. The August 1991 coup attempt by hardliners fails, further discrediting the old guard. By the end of that year, the Soviet Union is dissolved. No single battle decided it. No formal surrender document ended it. Instead, a system that once seemed too big to fail disintegrated under the weight of unsolved contradictions. Pattern and present echoes. Looking back, it's tempting to tell the story in binaries: capitalism won, communism lost. But that framing misses the deeper pattern. The Soviet collapse is not just about ideology. It is about what happens when a state tries to control more information than any center can realistically process. A system suppresses bad news until it becomes unmanageable. Prestige projects and military posture are protected, while everyday life and incentives are neglected. Short-term windfalls, like oil or sudden catch-up growth, are used to delay reform instead of enabling it. And when an entire political order is built on the claim that it is the future, admitting that it has fundamental flaws becomes existentially dangerous. In that sense, the Soviet Union followed a pattern we have seen before and since. Early rapid gains that seem to validate the model. A long period where problems are visible but denied. Growing dependence on symbolic strength, parades, statistics, military power, to cover underlying economic and social weaknesses. And then a phase where attempts at controlled reform accelerate the very forces they were meant to contain. Today, the technologies are different, the language is different. Few major powers openly claim to be planning the entire economy from the center, but the temptations remain familiar: to hide structural problems behind impressive numbers, to sacrifice flexibility for control, to double down on prestige and projection of power, even as the foundations of prosperity erode. The Soviet Union is gone, but the pattern that brought it down, that mix of over-control, denial, and delayed adaptation, is still very much alive in the modern world. On this channel, we're not here to celebrate anyone's collapse or to pretend that history moves in neat, predictable cycles. We're here to trace the patterns that keep showing up, from Spain's silver to Britain's pound to the Soviet command economy and today's dollarized finance, so that when systems start to creak, we can recognize the echoes sooner. If you want to see how past empires and experiments fell apart from the inside, and what that might say about the structures we live inside now, subscribe to Collapse Pattern. Don't just watch history happen, see it coming.